Sunday nights, usually on Sunday nights, Judy and I go down to Meadow Baptist Church in Lawrenceville. They've been helping us out a lot around here, and just a bunch of awesome people. But they've got a thing on their sign, like ours here, inside the church, that giving announcements and all that kind of stuff. And their pastor came up with a unique way of telling people to turn off their cell phones. And he simply says, be sure you turn your cell phone back on after service. I tell you, man, there's been some times where I forgot this, and this thing was ringing from up here. That is not good. So, anyway, you dig that for what it's worth. Today, I'm going to drop the bomb on you that I talked to you about earlier, and I kind of hooked you in. This is called a bait and switch. I hooked you in on a study about Moses, and by the time we get done with this today, you're going to realize how parallel your life is with it. And this guy was a biblical champion, but it wasn't because of anything he did. So I want to share with you that today. Some points that we went over last week is we got 6 of them here. The points we went over. God's plan is engaged way before it's revealed. God's got this thing worked out. He's already in our tomorrows because He's got it planned out. We will arrive into His plan tomorrow for tomorrow. He's already worked this stuff out. He's smart. He's bigger than all that we can even imagine. So God already knew before you were born what His plan for your life was. It was the same with Moses. We just learned that. Can you imagine what God had to do to make it to where Moses would even be alive? To do all this mighty stuff that he did. And so God's plan is engaged. God's plan is already written way before we see the results of it. Judy and I are always blown away at what God comes up with for our lives. You know, just how His provision and stuff. We would never expect things to turn out the way they do, but they always turn out for the good. And number 2, God protected Moses from birth. You guys remember last week we talked about how Pharaoh had made a decree that all the youngins, the males, were going to be killed. And so what an amazing thing that how he was saved from that and being put in the basket, floated down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter, of all people, would see the baby and want to raise it herself. Who could ever thought that would ever happen? And so when you step back and look at that, you see, well, obviously God's got a plan for this baby, and it ain't death. And God's going to use it. And He'll use us too. And then the third thing is, Moses knew the strength of the enemy. Guys, like I keep saying, you've got to stand back from this whole thing and look at it from a distance. Moses was raised up in Pharaoh's household. You know, that's the enemy. How better to know the enemy than to be living with the enemy and being raised up in that. So Moses was getting trained for his mission way before God sent him on a mission, and he didn't even know it. And God is doing the same thing with us, guys. We have no clue what's getting ready to happen. And yet, God is working things out. We're going through situations that will strengthen us for what He's got planned for us. And so it's really cool. And then, this next one, I almost didn't put that in there, but it really ties it all together. Moses was a murderer. Remember when he saw one of the guards abusing an Israelite, and he just killed the dude and buried him in the sand. And he looked, remember when he was getting ready to kill this guy, he looked around back and forth, just like we would do if we're getting ready He looked back and forth, make sure nobody was watching, and just killed the dude. Then covered up the crime. Just kind of like what we do, you know. Especially when we're back in our mess. You know, we would do whatever we could to cover up or to not be blamed for what we've just done. And then it's number 5, it says Moses fled. So he run off because Pharaoh heard about it and Pharaoh was going to kill him. And so Moses run off. How many of us in here have done some deeds that weren't legal and ended up running off to keep the cops off of us? It's the same thing. Moses committed a crime and he ran off so he wouldn't have to pay the price. It's the same thing we do, or did. Okay? And then the last thing, God gave Moses his marching orders from within a burning bush. Now you might think that you mean God would use a lawbreaker? He would use a murderer? One thing I want to tell you guys, you can run and run and run. But God knows where you're at. God knew right where Moses was at, and he spoke to him from a burning bush where Moses was at. Moses didn't have to go somewhere to find him. Moses wasn't looking for him. God needed Moses to do something. Now, in our own lives, a lot of times what we do is we take our mess and disqualify ourselves because of that, and then we just don't do what we think we ought to do. And a lot of us have been running from that, even to this day. That just because of the scoundrels that we were, that we wouldn't even accept a mission that God would want to use us in a mighty way. But guys, I'm telling you here today, man, that is not the case. That is not the case. He will use you. He will use those that will be used, and he uses his people. The bottom line is, who's your daddy? That's the bottom line, you know. And so now, with all that, it's leading us up to today. And that's why I started off by telling you that this ain't really about you. This is about a parallel that you can look at your own life and with the backdrop of who Moses is. And like I said, everybody looks at Moses or even Paul, as a huge biblical champion. Well, neither one of them were. God is. And God will use us the same way. And it may not be, you know, leading a whole nation of people out. That was the mission God had for Moses. And he did it. Reluctantly, remember, he said, man, I can't talk. I stutter. God said, go. So, today we're going to start with the Exodus. You know how long the people of Israel were in bondage to the Egyptians? Anybody know? 430 years. Now, God knew their suffering. God even said in these scriptures that I have heard the sufferings of my people Israel, and I have come down to deal with it. But it's 430 years, generations, many generations. And sometimes, you know, we get an ache in our back, and we pray, and we think God needs to respond on our timeline right now. Well, guys, we don't know suffering. We don't know suffering. These people were being driven as slaves by the Egyptians. They were suffering and being killed by them. And we think that we suffer. We don't suffer. Not yet. So there's 430 years of bondage. Most people, using their carnal mind, will say, well, you know, God must not even give a rip. 430 years, how many generations is that? And they're still in slavery. We got to let God do what he does in his time. It's not going to make